processes. The session is going to focus on implications on gender. I have chosen to speak about sexual violence, which I have referred to as Gukurahundi public secret. Right. To begin with, sexual violence itself is not something new. It has been a characteristic and continues to be a characteristic of war, which is as old as time, and it targets mainly women and girls. This means that for as long as wars have been fought, sexual violence has been part of the weaponry used. And there are a number of examples of countries in the past and in the present that have used sexual violence on a massive scale. These include countries like Rwanda. Uref spoke earlier about the 800,000 to 1 million people who were massacred during the 100 days of the Rwanda genocide. But what few of us know is that there is approximately 250,000 women to about 500,000 women who were sexually violated during that same period of 100 days. We have examples of Bosnia and Herzegovina in the early 90s, where it is approximated that about 60,000 women were sexually violated. We have Sierra Leone, which is famous for its severed limbs, particularly arms. But very few of us know that there is approximately 50,000 women who were sexually violated during the civil war there. We have countries like Liberia, we have Sudan, we have the DRC, which at one point was dubbed the rape capital of the world because of the massive scale at which sexual violence was perpetrated. And we have, before and during the World War, the Japanese army comfort women, where women were abducted and forced to be sex slaves for the military. So sexual violence itself has historically been regarded a byproduct of war. It is not seen as something which is part of the war, but it is a byproduct. So it is something that is lesser than other genocidal crimes. So we have boys being boys, you know. If boys are fighting, they need the comfort of women, so they will force themselves of women. And unfortunately, Gukurahundi itself has, there is no exception when it comes to Gukurahundi. There is evidence that sexual violence was used on a massive scale, even though the number at this point is unknown. There has been extensive research conducted on the Gukurahundi atrocities. This includes the murders, the abductions, the arson that was perpetrated by the Gukurahundi. Yet there is very little known about the suffering of women at the hands of the 5th Brigade. There is very little investigation and as little documentation of the suffering of women during this time. So maybe before I continue, let me try and put this into context. What is sexual violence? Sexual violence itself is an act of a sexual nature by force in a coercive environment, and the victim lacks the capacity to give consent or to refuse. So even if they might be seen to be agreeing to the sexual relationship, they do not have the capacity to say no. They lack the capacity to say yes. And we find that rape is one of the most common, if not the most common form of sexual violence perpetrated against women. And rape itself is the actual physical penetration of a woman's body using a sexual organ or using any other object. That could be a stick, it could be a knife, it could be a bottle, you name it, any object that you could use to penetrate a woman's body. And then with regards to conflict, in this case the Gukurahundi conflict-related sexual violence itself, it involves rape, which I've just spoken about. It includes sexual slavery, where women are abducted and forced into sexual relationships with the military. It includes forced prostitution, forced marriages, and even forced pregnancy. And we see a lot of this within the Gukurahundi context. So it is some of these things and any other form of sexual violence that you can think of, which is of comparable gravity, that is perpetrated against women and girls. And this is in a situation which is directly linked to a conflict. And I'm talking mainly about women and boys because the evidence that we have on the ground is that within the Zimbabwean context and even globally in other conflict settings, women and girls are usually the target of sexual violence. That is not to say that men and boys have not been targeted, they have been. But we have to be careful when it comes to this, to note that the extent and the gravity to which men and boys are exposed to sexual violence cannot in any way be placed against the extent and gravity to which women and girls experience sexual violence in conflict settings, and maybe even in peace settings as well. So why use sexual violence in conflict settings? So sexual violence itself serves a fundamental purpose. Its aim is to humiliate the target population. And if I were to use Gukurahundi as an example, it was aimed at humiliating the Ndebele community. So it might be the woman herself who is sexually violated, it's the woman who's raped, who's abducted, but it is not only her who suffered, it is her family, it is her community, which is affected, which is humiliated, and this ultimately resulted in the erosion of the community fabric. So not only does it inflict harm on the woman herself, it strips her of her dignity, it strips her of her humanity, it strips the community and the family of their dignity, of their identity, of their culture, because we find that in many settings, including the Ndebele community, and I want to believe the Zimbabwean community as a whole, women are seen as the repositories of our culture. They are the reproducers of a society, and therefore by targeting them, you are in effect targeting her family and targeting her community. So one of the main reasons that have been put forward for the perpetuation of sexual violence in conflict is the structural gender inequalities that exist in society generally. So we may argue that sexual violence is more rampant in times of conflict, but if we were to look at society in peace settings, we find that sexual violence exists. I suppose it's fitting that we're talking about sexual violence today during the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. We find that this is a big issue in communities, even in peace settings. And therefore, this makes it easier for sexual violence to be used as a weapon in conflict settings. We find that women are subordinated to the men in their communities. And this subordination is extended and taken advantage of in times of conflict, thereby availing the opportunity for women to be sexually assaulted in one way or another. So the argument is that in war, there is an extension of the power relations between the sexes in society generally. However, even though there is evidence that sexual violence was used not only during Gukurahundi, but that it is one of the weapons of choice in conflict settings, we find that it has only been recognized in international law in the last 3 decades with the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda in 1993 and the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia. So it is only after the magnification of acts of sexual violence that international law considered sexual violence as a crime. So it is now seen as a gross human rights violation, it is a crime of war, and it is also a crime of genocide, which is prosecutable, whereby perpetrators can be punished. And the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda was the first tribunal to persecute perpetrators of sexual violence. So even though there has been increased attention globally to conflict-related sexual violence, we find that in many settings today, incidences of sexual violence in conflict continue to escalate. This is because, as I've already said, sexual violence in conflict is seen as a woman's problem. It is not important. Men are just being men. So why should we focus on that when people are dying, when homes are being torched, when people are being abducted? This is just one of those issues that is therefore relegated to the sidelines. Sexual violence itself, however, does have devastating consequences on communities, but particularly on women. These include physical consequences, socioeconomic consequences, as well as psychological consequences. A number of women who've been sexually violated have trouble getting into intimate relationships. Some have trouble getting out of their homes because they are afraid that out there is where danger lives. So women continue during conflict and even in the aftermath to live with these consequences. Some are unable to have children. Some have born children as a result of being raped. And this is one of the physical consequences that many have to live with in the aftermath of sexual violence in a conflict setting. So as I've already said, there is little attention that has been paid to sexual violence during the Gukurahundi genocide, despite evidence, even though it's been anecdotal evidence, that it was used on a massive scale. And this has ensured that there is continued impunity and that the subject continues to be relegated, and therefore it continues to be silenced when it comes to transitional justice initiative. So in brief, within the Gukurahundi genocide, there is an unknown number of women who've been sexually assaulted. We know that there is between 10,000 and 20,000 people who were massacred during the genocide. We know that hundreds were abducted, thousands of people were physically assaulted, hundreds of homes were torched to the ground. But when it comes to sexual violence, we have no idea how many women, or even an estimation of how many women were sexually violated during this time. So research on Gukurahundi in Zimbabwe continues to be relegated to the sidelines. There is more focus on these other genocidal crimes that I've alluded to, but there is a tendency to gloss over sexual violence crimes because they are not seen as being as grave as these other genocidal crimes. And therefore, within the Zimbabwean context, there is very limited, if not no, access to physical and psychological support for survivors of sexual violence, and mainly because there is a lot of silence around the subject. Right. So why am I talking about sexual violence as a public secret? Historically, we find that experiences of sexual violence are often shrouded in silence and secrecy. One researcher refers to public secrets as entailing secrets that you pretend not to know, and that everybody pretends not to know. And the operative word here is pretending. It means that we know what it is. We know that it's there, but we pretend that it is not there. And this is a way of silencing conversations around sexual violence. There is therefore a conspiracy of silence around sexual violence. And what is conspiracy of silence? It is the social phenomenon whereby a group of people tacitly agree to outwardly ignore something that they are all aware of, that they all know happened. And this is usually a subject that makes people uncomfortable. It is a subject that they do not want to publicly discuss for reasons that include shame, that include fear, guilt, or pain. And this is the case with sexual violence within the Gukurahundi genocide. In many communities, it is known that sexual violence occurred, but people pretend that it didn't. They have chosen to silence that subject because it brings about shame, not only to the individual, but it brings shame to the family, it brings shame to the community. There is therefore this mutual denial of the subject of sexual violence. We find that in life, people decide what they remember about their past. And when it comes to remembering painful past, we choose what we're going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about. People can speak at length about a specific period in their lives and yet leave out certain aspects of that experience. And this appears to be the case with sexual violence that was perpetrated during the Gukurahundi genocide. We find that there is many narratives on the killings, on the abductions, and yet there is very little information that is revealed about people's experiences or communities' experiences of sexual violence. In many cases, it is seen more as a mass crime. You know, it happens. People were raped. They were raping women. They were raping women over there. But there is very minimal individual characteristics in these narratives. The narratives are not individualistic. They are never specific. There are never any specific personal narratives around what happened or how it happened because of the shame and surrounding the subject. So sexual violence in Gukurahundi, as I've already said, there is evidence of the widespread use of sexual violence during Gukurahundi, and we have seminal works such as Breaking the Silence. We have documentaries that include I Want My Virginity Back by Sight. We have untold stories of women by Habakkuk Trust that speak to women's experiences of sexual violence. When we look at the CCJP report, it doesn't speak that extensively about sexual violence, and this is also as a result of the shame and the guilt that accompanies the subject. So for a very long time, we had mostly anecdotal evidence of sexual violence whenever discussions of Gukurahundi come up. Public discussions, I'm repeating myself, public discussions on Gukurahundi will focus on the murders, on the burned homes, on the beatings, but sexual violence is often mentioned in passing. So there is this reluctance to talk about these experiences. And you find that it is not just the victim who doesn't want to talk about their experience, maybe because they are afraid, they are guilty, they are ashamed, but the whole family, the whole community has decided that the subject is supposed to be silenced. So it has not become part of the community canonical narratives about Gukurahundi. So when you talk about Gukurahundi, you talk about the massacres, we talk about the abductions, we talk about all these other types of violence. But when it comes to sexual violence, no, it cannot be part of the community narrative around what happened because it brings shame to the community. So there's not only shame and guilt and fear, but there's also the idea of culturally imposed taboos around the subject, and this has contributed massively to keeping victims of sexual violence silent. Even in literature, as I've already said, there is very little mention of Gukurahundi. The CCJP report cites underreporting as one of the reasons. I quote, "Many victims are now married with families and have put the incident behind them. Interviews pointed to rape having occurred, but when interviewees were asked directly if rape took place, this was denied." So the silence becomes the default mechanism. That is, not talking about it means that it did not happen. In many cases, if we stop talking about an incident, it's as good as erasing it from public discourse or from private discourse, but it means that it never happened. We are declaring it as something that has not happened, because with time we end up forgetting about it and we do not talk about it. So there's many narratives of young women engaging in relationships with the Gukurahundi soldiers, right? But one thing that we need to be aware of is that most of these women did not have these relationships, did not engage in these relationships with the soldiers out of choice. One scholar argues that in conflict settings, when women and girls engage in sexual relationships with perpetrators of violence, they may appear to have control over their own bodies and how they use it, yet they have very little choice. All other means of survival are closed off to them. So these women they are not really given a choice. Some have referred to this as choiceless choices. You are given an array of choices and you have to pick one, and all of them are not good choices. But at the end of the day, if you are to survive, if your family is to survive, if your home is not to be torched to the ground, women end up sacrificing, and women in this case ended up sacrificing their bodies to the Gukurahundi soldiers. In one community, I remember a man saying that we survived death because of these women. He didn't elaborate, but reading between the lines, it was clear that he said they were saved by their women giving themselves to the soldiers. Right. The subject of Gukurahundi itself has until recently been shrouded in secrecy. I mean, it was only after President Mnangagwa and his new dispensation decreed that people could now talk about Gukurahundi. People were given permission to now discuss experiences around Gukurahundi. As Doran says, the topic has been taboo in many circles in Zimbabwe. In community circles, political circles, it has been a taboo subject to talk about. And therefore, because Gukurahundi itself has been shrouded in secrecy, this has also resulted in silenced talk around sexual violence. There's been very little effort, therefore, in national law to address Gukurahundi sexual violence. This is not to say that there have been a great many efforts to try and address the issue of Gukurahundi itself. I think that is why we're here today. But the silencing of sexual violence itself, the removal of sexual violence itself means that it is not part of public discourse around Gukurahundi, and therefore there will be very little attempt to try and address it at a national level. After the unity government, there was the organ for national healing. I think it was National Healing, Reconciliation and Integration, if I'm not mistaken. And one scholar says that that initiative did not in any way address the issue of gender, address the issue of sexual violence. And now we have the National Peace and Reconciliation Act, which in itself provides for a gender unit that will, among other things, investigate the use of sexual crimes during and after conflict. And obviously this includes the Gukurahundi genocide. So in response to this provision, a victim support, diversity management and gender committee was established by the Commission to address these issues. Yet, as far as I'm concerned, I stand to be corrected, there has not been any concerted effort to address Gukurahundi sexual violence crimes, meaning that there is no chance for justice, there is no chance for reparations for the victims and the survivors of sexual violence during the genocide. And the NPRC only has 1 year left of its mandate. So the chances of women getting justice from where I'm standing are very, very little. Women are often the spotlight of sexual violence in conflict. There are many narratives of the many children that were born of rape during that time. However, you find that in many discussions, each time that conversations around these children of rape, which to many are a constant reminder of the violence that was suffered by the mothers, by the women. Yet it is often in relation to attaining birth certificates. It's not often that you'll find that people are talking about these children born of rape because they are concerned about the rape of their mothers, because they feel so strongly about what happened to the women. We talk about other things. Children don't have birth certificates, they can't go to school, they can't get jobs. So little is known about these children's experiences. little is known about the experiences of these mothers as a result of these children born out of rape. We have stories of mothers crying because they say, as a result of knowing the paternity of that child. And I think this is very common in our culture, where at times you need to consult your ancestors, you need to consult Abadala in order to address certain issues. I'm going to give an example in a minute of such an incident where a mother feels that her child is suffering because she has no contact and has no way of ever contacting her paternal family because the mother doesn't know who the paternal family is. So within the Gukurahundi genocide, there is little evidence of this happening. So what are the key issues when it comes to sexual violence in conflict, and in this case, sexual violence during the Gukurahundi genocide? As I've said, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of stigma, of fear, of guilt and embarrassment. And these are some of the biggest reasons behind the secrecy for many victims. However, there is also the shame and the fear, and what I believe is the anger of the men, of the patriarchy in the community, because of their failure to stand up for their women, to stand up to the soldiers. Because many narratives are about women being taken in community meetings. For example, if they were meeting, I just pick this one and that one and that one, and the parents are there, the uncles, the brothers, they're there, and there's very little that they can do. They are so afraid, they cannot fight for their women and say, no one is going to take these women. So this breeds anger, right? Such that at the end of the day, the anger does not belong to the woman who is the victim. The anger belongs to her husband, belongs to her brother, to her father. She is just there as a constant reminder of what happened, but it is the men who are angry because they are women. And I say they are women because women become possessions. They were violated in front of them by Shona men, and that is the greatest dishonor that a man can experience. So these men are dehumanized. They are emasculated, if you will, because the enemy is saying, look at us, we're raping your women, what are you going to do about it? And therefore, in the aftermath of the war, there is this anger. In some settings, not necessarily Gukurahundi, I haven't looked into that yet, you find that many men who have experienced the sexual assault of their women in front of their mother, they become physically abusive in the aftermath of the conflict because they cannot stand the anger and the pain. They cannot stand the fact that they've been emasculated, and the wife knows that you were there and you were able to protect me. So they end up perpetrating violence against these very women who were sexually violated during the conflict. And this is something that I believe is worth looking into within the Gukurahundi genocide because it has happened in other settings. So we find that the men themselves, the patriarchy, therefore it contributes to the silencing in that they own that anger, they own the shame. So in order to save the family, in order to save the husband and the community from this dishonor of sexual violence and the failure of that community to protect you, you are better off staying silent. You are more acceptable if you stay silent because the more you speak about your experiences, you are continuously exposing, you are continuously bringing dishonor and displaying the failures of the community publicly. So the secrecy has also meant that many victims haven't had access to not only physical support, but also psychosocial services. Because I mean, how do you seek counseling if you are not? How are you going to talk? You are not allowed to talk about this. So you will not actively seek out psychosocial support. You will not actively go to a hospital because that would mean that you have to talk about your experiences. And because of this culturally imposed taboos around the subject, it becomes very difficult for these women to seek such support. So there has been very little effort to try and assess the impact that this has had, especially the lack of psychosocial support. What impact has it had on the individual herself? What impact has it had on the family and on the community at large? Documenting the experiences of Gukurahundi victims and survivors, which hasn't happened that much to date, will be a step towards accountability, towards justice and reparations, and thus helping survivors to heal and rebuild their communities. And by healing the survivors, it in effect heals the family and the community as a whole, and it needs this torn community social fabric that would have been destroyed. So there is need for gender-sensitive ways of investigating sexual violence crimes during conflict, and in this case during the Gukurahundi genocide, because this is yet to happen. And this will feed into mechanisms of preventing future recurrence, And it ensures that gender-based violence is not marginalized, but it is recognized as occurring in the front line of conflict. So some of the narratives of sexual violence that I've come across, just in brief, someone says that when a soldier is carrying a gun, he will not ask to be in a relationship with you. The soldier is not going to proposition love to you. They are going to tell you, come with me, and you will go with them because you have no power and capable of saying no. Another woman said, even if you didn't want, they took you by force. No one could leave, even if the adults were there. So this shows the emasculation of our parents, of brothers, of the community at large, because they are there, they know what is going to happen to this woman, but they are powerless to do anything. And these women knew that there was nothing that their communities could do to protect them. Another said, we were destroyed, my brother. We were not virgins when our husbands married us. We were in tatters. In Isindebele, she expressed it as in very, and it created this picture in me where you see something which is so torn, so it is in tatters, but it created this image which was horrifying for me. And then one said, raping me, they did rape me and they were taking turns. Another said, he did what he wanted to do to me even though I was a child. Another said, they hit me in my hidden places. I'm not okay in my hidden places. So many women tend to talk about their experiences using euphemisms. They talk about hidden places, they talk about he made me lie down and climb on top of me and made me his wife. So being made a man's wife means that they are sexually violating you. They will take the women in the evenings and go and cook for them, and then they would return in the morning. What kind of cooking takes place like that? So these are some of the narratives that women talk about when they are referring to sexual violence. Thank you very much.